We're in Daniel chapter 3, and I just want to start reading, and I want you to get a picture of this. Now, this is one of the most well-known passages in the Bible. And because it's so well-known, it would be almost like we could say, I've heard that before. I know that story, and that we would forget to get the significance out of it that it has for us today. And so I want to encourage you, even as we read through it, even as we look at it, to look for the new thing that God would have for you today that comes out of the passage. It always surprises me that regardless of the number of times that I go through a passage, regardless of how many times I read through it or how many times I preach on it, how it speaks things to me where it's like, wow, that's totally new. I'm finding that as I read through the Bible again this year is that there's passages that I just find myself enthralled with Scripture once again. And the same thing is true here. And I'm going to try not to, I tried to read all 30 verses during the first service, and it ended up being so much. And so let me just set it up for you, and then we'll read the verses that help us to kind of dig in the most. But King Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man in the world of his day, but he also represented as one of the most powerful nations to ever exist on the planet Earth. And last week we talked about that he had a dream at one point during his rule. He had a dream that so troubled him, that so concerned him, that he didn't even know how to process it. And so he called together all of the wise men of Babylon, and he said, and he knew that he couldn't give them the content of the dream because he knew that they would make up an interpretation. And so he said I want you to give me the dream and the meaning of the dream. And they said, there is no one on the planet Earth that can do that. Only the gods know what goes on in a man's mind. And he said, but I know that if I give you the content of the dream, you're going to give me some answer in order to placate me. And he ordered the execution of all of the wise men in Babylon. He had them arrested, and he set their execution date. And when the king's guard came to arrest Daniel, Daniel said, hey, what's all of this about? And the guard explained to him what had happened. And Daniel said tell the king that I will interpret his dream. Give me time. And so last week, as I gave you these three things to remember, the first one was pause. Tell the king to give me a little bit of time. And then Daniel went to his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they spent an entire night in prayer. And so the second one is pray. Pause and pray. And we're told that during the night, God gave Daniel the same dream and the interpretation. And it's interesting because the next day when he went before King Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, are you able to tell me? And Daniel says, no, I'm not. I'm not able to tell you, but there is a God in heaven who knows. And he has told me, and I love that because Daniel refuses to take any credit for himself. He refuses to put himself any higher than he is. I can't do it, King. But there is a God in heaven who can. And that third thing that I asked you to remember last week is the pause, the pray, and the position. That he stays in a position of humility. And he humbly comes before the king, and he gives credit where credit is due. And he says that there is a God in heaven. I can't do anything apart from him. And he positions himself in a place of humility, and yet at the same time, he says that God has given you the answer. And in so doing is Daniel not only saves himself and his three friends, but he saves all of the wise men of Babylon. In chapter 3, there's a significant amount of time that has passed, and now we have Nebuchadnezzar, and what Nebuchadnezzar does, and you have to wonder if there's a connection between the statue that he sees in his dream, and Daniel tells him is that the head of gold represents you, because you are this picture of power. There is no other kingdom that has ever been like yours. And now Nebuchadnezzar, he doesn't just make the head gold, but he makes the whole statue gold, and it represents his kingdom. And he tells all of the people of his kingdom, all of the leaders of his kingdom, not all of the people aren't there, but all of the leaders of his kingdom, and there's a bunch because this is, remember, the most powerful nation in the world. And he has all of these wise men and all of these governors, and he calls them up. And he says is that, hey, there's this statue that I've made, and when the instruments play, you need to fall down and you need to worship the statue. And we're told about all of these different leaders. They're satraps and prefects and governors and advisors and treasurers and judges and magistrates and all of these provincial officials. And this is a state ceremony. There's a state ceremony, and they're there, and the musicians are going to play, and then every representative of the government is called to fall down before the statue and to worship. And of course, this is going to be a problem for the Jews that are represented in his government. We only know that there's 4 of them. It may be that they were the only 4 of the exiles that were brought into the government of Babylon. We're going to assume that. But they had to decide whether or not they were going to bow down and worship the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So there's 3 things that I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk about what does it look like to identify the demands of idolatry. Not just that are represented in the text here, but that are represented in our own lives. And then how do we recognize the either-or challenges that go on in our lives? Either do this or do this. And then what does it look like to depend on God's deliverance? What does it look like to depend on God's deliverance? And so identify the demands of idolatry, the first one. What does idolatry look like in our time? What does it look like in our day? German theologian Paul Tillich said is that a person's God is the thing or the person that one is most concerned about, or the effects that affects one's life the most. A person's God is the image or the thing that one is most concerned about or affects one's life the most. What might that image or that thing be for you? Because sometimes when we read the Old Testament, we find out that people actually bowed down to images of wood or images of stone. We're really dismissive. We really look down on those people. We say, that is so dumb. Or we could say that. But the truth is that we have our images too. They just may not sit on some kind of a mantle in our home. It might actually be our home. It might be other things. And it's so easy for things to become an idol in our lives. In fact, we're constantly tempted, and idols are subtle. In fact, for the Germans during World War II, when Germany was being faced with Hitler's rule, one of Hitler's supporters, Baldur von Schirach, declared that one cannot be a good German and at the same time deny God. Sounds good so far, right? But then he subtly twisted things, and he went on to say, whoever serves Adolf Hitler, the Fuhrer, serves Germany, and whoever serves Germany serves God. Do you see how subtle that became? He starts with God. One cannot be a good German and at the same time deny God. Start with God. Shift to the nation and to Hitler himself. When you serve Adolf Hitler, you serve Germany and you serve God. And all of a sudden, Adolf Hitler and the nation become the center. When you serve them, you serve God. Really? And a nation, including most of the church, bought into it. And look what idolatry did to millions of people. Israel was called by God to be God's people and to represent God everywhere. They were called to worship God and God only. God said, "You shall have no other gods before me." They were never supposed to come first themselves. They were never supposed to think of themselves first or to try to preserve themselves first. God would lift up Israel as Israel lifted up God. Martin Buber was a philosopher, an author, and a theologian. And here's what he said is he said, the danger for every nation is inclined to make an idol of its own inner spirit. Every nation is, and I would just say is every nation is tempted to make an idol of itself and the things that are important to it. We face the same danger as every other nation. Even there's a little bit of a danger, or maybe a lot of a danger in saying is we just wish things could go back to normal, whatever normal is. Where we had an economy that was running for the most part on all cylinders, where we had 3% unemployment, where we didn't have some virus that we can't see infecting the world. And there's a sense in which is that want for the best could become the idol, and that we're actually giving up what's best. And what's best is actually God himself, not necessarily the comfort that we have or not having problems or things like that. We face the same danger that Israel faced and that other nations have faced throughout times. Psalm 115, 2-8 says, "Why did the nations say, 'Where is their God?' And then it says, 'Our God is in heaven. He does what pleases him. But their idols are silver and gold made by human hands. They have mouths, but they cannot speak, eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but cannot hear, noses, but cannot smell. They have hands, but cannot feel, feet, but cannot walk. Nor can they utter a sound with their throats. Those who make them will become like them.'" Otherwise, as we become like the idols that we put on the thrones of our lives. Bill Bright used to ask the question is who is on the throne of your life? Because anything or anyone that you give more attention to than God becomes an idol. Part of the reason why Israel found itself in exile was because they gave themselves over to idol worship, thinking that they would become stronger, but they became weaker. Because here's what's happened is when we give ourselves over to idols, is we think that those things will make us happy. We think that those things will make us feel better and feel stronger. But the truth is that when we give our things over to idol worship, whatever idol worship looks like for each one of us, is we don't find ourselves better, we find ourselves worse. We don't find ourselves stronger, we find ourselves weaker. We don't find ourselves being more human, we find ourselves being less human, like a piece of wood that's fashioned in some shape, or like a statue. We lose the humanity that God meant for us to have when we let other things take control of our lives. And we become like those things. And so much of what we idolize can be represented in the addictions that we see manifest in humanity. Whether it's alcoholism or drugs or sex or hobbies that are overindulged in, or workaholism, or relationships that are out of boundaries, or gearing our lives to please other people, or the pursuit of knowledge, or whatever it is. That we pursue all of these things hoping that we'll feel better, that we'll feel stronger, that we'll have more money, or that we'll have more things. And as we're chasing those things, we're losing our humanity to those things, and we're actually not getting stronger. We're getting weaker, and we're not becoming more human, we're becoming less human. And the danger of idolatry is just as real for us as it was for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because the list of what we can idolize is so vast. And what we idolize, we protect. And what we protect, we lift up. And what we lift up, we put ourselves under. And what we put ourselves under, we worship and serve. And what we worship and serve, we value. And at the same time that we're valuing it, we devalue ourselves. And so, it's really important that we identify the demands of idolatry. Identify the demands of idolatry. King Nebuchadnezzar calls all of the leaders of the nation and says, at the sound of the music, bow down and worship. And it says, is that the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples in every language, this is what you're commanded to do as you hear the sound. And then it lists all of these musical instruments. Fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. And you think is that this furnace had smelted all of the gold for this idol, this statue. And it had been fashioned and set up, and you can imagine what it looked like. It's said to be on the plain of Dura, and archaeologists and historians tell us is that this is where the Persians and the Babylonians would set up these statues, and there were many statues throughout history. And this was among the largest. There was only one other that they know of for sure that was as large as this one, and it was set up, and you can imagine is because in this place the sun shines, and it shines hot, and it shines bright. And can you imagine that image of gold? It would almost be blinding to the eyes. Probably intentionally so. It was intended to both be magnificent and overwhelming and probably even grotesque at the same time. That probably wasn't the intention, but it probably was a little bit grotesque to see this massive image of gold. And the command is that do this or this. And so it's important that we recognize the either or that is placed before us. Because that either or, when it comes to the idols of our world, are the same. Is either you're going to conform to what's acceptable in culture, or you're going to be marginalized. You're going to be pushed to the side. You're going to be made fun of. You're going to become a joke. You're going to be demeaned. You're going to be looked down on. You're going to be thought to be stupid. And this is happening right now. And part of it is our own fault because of some of the stances that we've taken and some of the things that we've done in culture to where we really haven't always honored God. And in the church, we a lot of times we don't look any different from culture. We have the same number of scandals that we see in culture, but it's always worse when it's in the church, because we claim that we should be different. And culture, especially now, there's this incredible pressure to conform in our culture. Is watch the same movies, do the same things, have the same values in regards to sexuality and food and drink and all of those kinds of things. And it's this conform. This call to conform. And the either or is you will conform or you will be punished. And I don't know exactly what the punishment looks like. Is we're not dealing with what other places in the world that are dealing with. I mean, other places in the world, they have the risk of losing their lives. Lives. I'm tired. And I mean, it's a real danger in many parts of the world, but to think that our danger is less because we will lose our lives a little bit at a time as we give away our humanity. And so this last week I was reading an article about a pastor, I think it's in Nigeria. He had gone to Calvin Seminary, and the church there is being persecuted like you just can't even imagine. And both he and his wife were gunned down. They had 8 children. And I thought, Lord, that's so terrible, what's going on in so many of those countries. And some of those countries aren't far from where we do work in those parts of the world and what they face. But it's almost though, as I was studying for this, is the danger is just as present for us, but because we're not paying attention, we don't realize that we could be just as easily taken out and are being taken out if the statistics about what people are saying about with what's happening in the church. Is they're saying that young people are leaving the church in droves. And I don't know how much of it is true or not. Statistics can say a lot of things, but young people are leaving the church because the world is just a lot more attractive. And because they see a lot of things in the church that they don't like. For those of you that are younger, I want to encourage you yes, there are a lot of things in the church that you could easily criticize. But our eyes are to be on Jesus, not on the people in the church. As people in the church will let you down. They will make mistakes. They will say things that they shouldn't say. Jesus is the only one who's perfect. And so keep your eyes on Jesus, but stay a part of his body also. Culture seems to offer more acceptance and a lot of things but question what's going on in culture too. Don't just question what's going on in the church, or don't just question the Bible, but question the questions that are being asked about the church and asked about the Bible. And you might find that what's out there is also very unsatisfying, is that the only one who satisfies is Jesus. He is the only one who is perfect and the only one who is good. And we are called to represent him. And the reason why church is important is because prayerfully, when we are the true church, we are coming to him and saying, Jesus, teach us to be more like you. Teach us to be your hands and your feet in a very broken world. And so recognize the either or that we're faced with. Is that we can conform with culture, or we can say no, but saying no to conformity will mean punishment on some level or another, whether it's marginalized or ostracized or seen as being dumb or whatever it is. And so recognize the either or. And what happened when Nebuchadnezzar put the either or out there, either you're going to bow and you're going to fall down, or you're going to be destroyed. And the music started playing and the people started falling, and everyone bowed down except 3 Jews. 3 Jews. And the amazing thing is, no one would have noticed. No one would have noticed. Except these Jews had some enemies. And the enemies were the very people that were saved in chapter 2. And they go to the king and they say, it says they denounced the Jews. In verse 9, they said, King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound, and then it lists all of the musical instruments again, that at the sound of the music, everyone will fall down and worship the image of gold, and whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. There are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. It says that Nebuchadnezzar was furious with rage, and he commanded that the three men be brought forward. And they're brought forward, and he says, "Is it true? Is it true that you do not serve my gods or bow down to my image?" And he says, "You will bow down, or else you will be immediately thrown into the blazing furnace." The third really important thing for us to remember as we're processing the demands of idolatry, recognizing the either or. The third thing, depend on God's deliverance. Depend on God's deliverance. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. He said, "You're going to bow down or else." And here's what they said. Is King Nebuchadnezzar, "We do not need to defend ourselves before you." Can you imagine saying that to the most powerful man in the world? We don't need to defend ourselves at all. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to make any comments, any remarks. We don't need to defend ourselves in front of you. Now, they weren't being disrespectful. They were just putting their priorities in the right place and letting the king know that they had a greater priority, and that priority was to honor and worship God. They weren't being irreverent to the king. They were being reverent to God. But they give themselves the opportunity to throw out two comments. The first one is if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, then our God is able to rescue us. And then the second comment, which is very interesting, but even if he does not. So it actually is their first comment is, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us. He will do it. And then they say, but even if he does not, we win, you lose. You know, that no matter what happens, is our God is always able to deliver us, and they're able to say with a surety, they're able to say is he will deliver us, but even if he does not, we win. And it's the reason why believers throughout history have been willing to give their lives, because of that firm conviction is that our God's able to save us, but even if he does not, it's okay because we win. Now, they were saying this before the resurrection. They didn't have the concept of resurrection that we have, but they knew that God could do something and that he would do something, even if by all appearances he didn't. He is able to save us. He will save us, but even if he does not, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Can you imagine having that kind of conviction in a culture like ours? We won't compromise. We won't give up our conviction. Is we're able to stand and we're able to be delivered by God regardless of what comes up. But even if he doesn't, we're going to stand firm. And then it says that Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. And it's interesting is because it said that he set up this image, and right there, if you look in the original language, it means his image towards them changed. That he wanted everyone to honor the image, and what happened is that his image got distorted in the process. His image got distorted, and he was angry because they wouldn't do what he said to do, and so he commanded that they be tied up, and that they be taken and that they be thrown into the furnace. And there's a great turnaround that happens because we're told that the soldiers that take Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the soldiers that had conformed to the king's command, the soldiers that did everything that the king told them to do, the ones that were supposed to be preserved are the ones that die, and the ones that are supposed to die, it says the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot and the flames of fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. They fell into the blazing furnace. And then it says, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, your majesty. And he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th one looks like the son of the gods. The king never intended for his question to get answered. What God will save you from my hands? What God is there that can save you from my hands if you don't do this? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is none by his estimation. And he gets the answer. And it's so interesting. John Calvin says this, is that God could have quenched the flames of the fire and saved these young men. But he didn't quench the flames of the fire. He didn't save them by stopping the fire on the front end, just making it go out. He didn't save them from the fire. He saved them in the fire. And in the fire, Nebuchadnezzar is the first one to see is that there's a 4th person walking around, and they are walking as though they are taking a stroll in a garden and not being consumed. God's deliverance is also a proclamation. No one can destroy whom I am going to deliver. That it is God who rescues the 3 men is without a doubt, and Nebuchadnezzar knows it. Who's the 4th person in the fire? Was it an angel or was it God? That it is God that rescues, there is no doubt. In a sense, it doesn't make any difference whether it was an angel or God. It's still God that's the Savior, God that's the Redeemer, God that's the hero. You know, we sang that earlier. It's God that is the way maker who makes a way when there is no way. Who is the 4th person? Now, some theologians have said is that there's, in the Old Testament, there's theophanies, which is God in the person of Jesus Christ showing up in the Old Testament, pre-incarnate, before the incarnation, that it's Jesus showing up. And there's a lot of reason to believe that that could be true. Now, was it Jesus? You know what? We don't know for sure. There's no way to know for sure whether that was a theophany, even though we have said, yeah, it very well could have been Jesus himself, pre-incarnate, before being born as a human. But we don't know. But here's what we do know, is in the New Testament, when the angel came to Joseph, he said that Mary will be with child and will deliver a child, and he will be Savior, and he will be called Emmanuel, God with us. And at the very least, the 4th person in the fire is a reflection of Emmanuel, the God who is with us when we go through the furnace fires of life. And in this, we cannot help but see Jesus.